We are waiting right now. We're going to be hopefully talking, speaking of school, talking to a gentleman who works with a wellness group that is worried about the mental health of our students getting back after the pandemic and getting back to classes. So I know that, Joe, that's something you've been very interested in for quite a while.
Yeah, I mean, the state of our children ultimately, then in turn creates, certainty or uncertainty as to where we move into the future. And we all know what the proficiency rates look like as far as reading, writing, arithmetic. And it was nothing to pump our chests about prior to the pandemic. And then as a result of some of the decisions that have been made, we're dealing with kids that have fallen further behind, along with all of the other stresses related to the pandemic and disruptions that have gone on over the past few years that have helped aid some of those issues surrounding proficiency and just being able to socialize within that sort of setting. I mean, it's no surprise that many of the studies and other sorts of information show that kids have greater needs now due to the 2 years of disruption and pandemic stress. I mean, you could say that within Horry County schools, they've done a pretty good job at identifying some of the situations at hand and then moving forward with some solutions. And when things didn't necessarily work out, they have since come back to the table and said, listen, this hasn't been working out the way we had hoped it would. Let's sort of go back to the drawing board and see if we can implement something that needs to be, a part of our toolbox, so to speak.
And on the line with us right now, we do have Austin Gregg, who is the CEO of Connections Wellness Group. Austin is with us, and Austin, we appreciate you joining us here today as we've been talking throughout the last several months and couple of years as far as mental health is concerned. Thanks for joining us.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Now, before we go on, I want to make sure that you can hear my co-host, Joe. He is on remote location. We had some problems with the phone yesterday. Joe, say hello.
Yeah, hey, Austin. How are you doing this morning?
Could you hear that?
I'm doing great.
Okay,
Yep.
Fantastic. All right, we're good to go then. Excellent, Eric. All right. So what concerns you most about the state of the mental health of our kids going back to school these days?
I think there's something to be said when we're transitioning from one way of doing life, and maybe that's summer, or maybe that's just virtual school, and then going into a new routine. There's something to be said about that transition. It is already inherently taxing our mental health, but whenever you add on some of these factors that we've been experiencing, like you rightfully mentioned, the pandemic and that adjustment there, especially as we're growing and maturing. We even have this school shooting event, and there's an understandable anxiety that inserts itself. And I think that it is a very real thing, but the good news, it's a very treatable thing as well.
Austin, one of the things that makes me irate is the fact that within the schools and overall as a society, we have a hard time looking in the mirror and adjusting, adapting to things that don't necessarily work. Something that I was trying to highlight before you joined the show was the fact that our school district locally realized that some of the remote situations that we had in place, were not at the best interest of our kids, and there may be some other programs or ideas that we could think about outside the box. Let's revisit it and try and implement a new plan to associate that with our toolbox as a whole, as how we address education and some of the needs of our kids. Why are we so hesitant to come up and look and examine some of the things that we've decided on, realize that they may not work out, and then make the tough decisions to sort of rehash that conversation? Why are we so hesitant to examine those sorts of things?
When I think it comes to either the systems that we're examining or even ourselves, sometimes I think that we're hesitant because if we were to examine something that was our original idea and our conclusion was that probably wasn't a very good idea, for some, that could be a really uncomfortable, vulnerable conversation. However, I think we all align that if we can have a constant evaluation of the application of our ideas, our innovation, we tweak what doesn't work, that's going to be healthy in any organizational system as well as within ourselves.
Austin Gregg is the CEO of Connections Wellness Group. And Austin, I know here in South Carolina, they allowed the 988 suicide and crisis number to be put on the back of everybody's school ID, just to make sure that kids have easy access to not only that number, but also some other mental health numbers from our area. Is that a good idea, or is there something more that can be done?
I think it's a great start, great idea. We're seeing some of the research, the utilization of that number. It's coming in a lot higher than what we expected. And honestly, I think that's a good thing. I think when we're talking about this, it doesn't live in the shadow, in the darkness. And I think when we're talking about health in general, any opportunity to improve it or improve access to it is going to benefit us, our communities, and everyone that we're around.
Austin, you had made mention that oftentimes it's difficult to sort of look in the mirror and realize that maybe an idea you had didn't work out, even though you had great, intentions. Some of the unintended consequences, overcame those original thoughts. I would say parents often deal with a lot of the same sort of issues when it comes to their children that may be struggling, and the unwillingness to look, examine, and then reach out to resources to, get these kids assistance that maybe you can't provide. How do you come to grips with that fact as a parent to then seek maybe that outside assistance to help out your child?
Such a great question. Whenever I think it comes to those, parents, we are experts in our kiddos and our adolescents and our children. We are the experts there. But there are some things and elements to it that we might not be experts, but we're experts in being able to find that help and coupling the needs that we identify with the resources that exist. I don't think it's shameful to say, I can't do everything. In fact, you may be modeling a really noble behavior for your kid, because if you try to do everything all the time, what you're essentially teaching is you must be good at everything all the time. And I'm not just sure that's realistic.
Now, Austin, a lot of money has been thrown around, obviously, towards schools after the CARES Act was passed during the pandemic. But if somebody has limited resources in a state or a school district, is it more important to spend money on a school resource officer or a school counselor?
It's a great question. I think it would ultimately boil down to the individual needs of the school, the opportunities there when we evaluate our mental health segments in greater need than others. Where are those resources? The good news, I think, is both of those investments are going to be worthy causes. It's just really pairing where the needs are.
And on that note, Austin, even though we may put resources towards this, that, or the other, unless we are operating through best practices and holding each other accountable, all the money in the world won't have much of a factor as far as one issue that we may be trying to tackle or another one: security, mental health stability. We could put all the money in there that we want, but if we're not utilizing our best practices, that money often falls through into a dark hole.
It certainly could, and I love the word you use, utilize, because the same could be true for having the resources, but not just tapping into the resources. And commonly, that's sometimes what we find in the mental health segment. We are worried about the stigma associated with mental health, and so sometimes we would rather struggle silently than tap into the resources. So in both of those equations, there could be funding and or resources underutilized. And part of me wonders, where is the actual root of all that?
Now, Austin Gregg is joining us here this morning with Corrections Wellness Group. And Austin, whether we're talking about Uvalde, Texas, or Parkland, Florida, everybody always goes back afterwards and says, oh, yeah, this red flag was there, this red flag was there. If you're a parent, what are some of the major red flags that you could look at to see that your child is maybe not socializing correctly or maybe has some issues?
Whenever it comes to mental health and our kiddos, one of the things that we teach our parents to look for is this word called anhedonia. And that's really just a fancy word that describes the withdrawal from things that we once found pleasurable. So if we like doing particular hobbies, but we no longer really want to do them anymore, we don't really want to hang out with our friends, we're isolating and withdrawing. All of these are typically the first sign that a conversation about mental health is needed.
Hey, Austin, and looking through your website at connectionswellnessgroup.com and browsing through your team, I quickly noticed that your team consists of members who have, sort of skin in the game, so to speak. So they're working alongside kids. They are a part of this entire thing, because oftentimes we hear a lot of outside people, thinking that they have the best ideas or practices. How important is it that you have, people who, really understand the issue to a level that maybe the ordinary Joe doesn't have their hands wrapped around to be able to make improvements on this and to be able to tap into these sorts of resources like your group to get best practices and ways in which we can get a handle on this spiraling situation?
I think when we have those qualifications, both from education standpoint, but also from a life standpoint, it does promote an advantage to minimize that learning curve, to immediately establish those meaningful connections. And once we reach that level of rapport, the conversations that we're able to have are more valuable, and the outcomes overall are more powerful.
Now, Austin, I was looking at one of the studies here, and they said that a Kids Count study showed that between 2016 and 2020, the number of children 3 to 17 years old that had mental health issues rose by 26%. Was a lot of that just during, post 2019 after the pandemic, or what was it between 2016 and 2019?
Well, one of the larger pieces that makes me wonder, and to the point, I would imagine that there was some anxiety impact from the recent events over the past few years. I think that's probably undeniable on that. But an additional piece of it is a lot more people are talking and engaging about the subject. 50 years ago, it would be folklore to talk about mental health and the struggles there. But now it just seems a little bit more routine. And so I'm wondering if some of these conditions existed, but we just didn't identify them because no one was having the right conversation.
Austin, outside of, again, the pandemic, and as you said, this may have been, something building up, years and years and years, and then this perfect storm all sort of came together. What sort of indications are out there that highlight the fact that, this has been a topic, or what sort of outside variables do you think have led to, increases, in mental health issues among our young people? What role does technology play into it, along with the fact, that inside the home, they may not be getting the guidance. I mean, this all has to play into this whole big umbrella that we have when we discuss mental health.
You're right, and there are so many variables at play here. You mentioned a worthy one, social media. That can be a good, but sometimes a deficit in there. It seems routine these days to open that app and be exposed to a worldly trauma or some type of element of bad news or something that provokes some stress and anxiety. And if that's our experience every day, opening the app, that weighs on us. The more that we ingest all of this information, we need to figure out how to do something with it. And sometimes, next thing we know, it sort of boils down to a burden. We find ourselves a little bit heavier, and we begin going down the slope of developing depression or anxiety.
All right, it's 9:20 on Hot Talk 99.5. Austin Gregg from Connections Wellness Group is joining us here today talking about our children's mental health. And back in my generation, and a little bit before as well, we used to have a lot of drills in our school when we were there as far as, storm drills. But in the generation before me, they did the nuclear drills where people would duck and cover. Stuff like that. Right now in schools, they're doing active shooter drills. Are things like that scaring our kids more than helping our kids by making them think that these things are imminent?
I think it's the way that it's framed up on it. I think that they're worthy drills, especially with what we know as known facts out there. It's better to be prepared for that. Having the conversation of why we're having it, I think, is important. And we as parents can also have it, because the narrative is going to exist one way or the other. There's going to be dialogue that's filled in. And if we have the opportunity to create that first round of narrative, that's a powerful position that I think we all want to be in. And so sometimes overlooking it and not talking about it might not be the right solution.
And Austin, on that note, though, it seems as if we lend towards an idea that everything is a glass half empty. How important is it for us as adults, educators, parents, just members of our community and society, to try and motivate and inspire through hope and joy, rather than just talking about all the negativity that we may see through social media and through all the other elements that we consume on a day-to-day basis?
I love the word joy, because as a parent, as a professional, if we go out to do worthy things, chances are it's worthy because it's hard. And if we're careful, we can equate our hard days to bad days. But joy is the type of piece that influences this equation. And if we can have joy on our hard days, it allows us to have a little bit more optimism, a little bit more positivity, and we begin offsetting the stress. So I think it's so critical to find those silver linings and to be able to look for the good. It's okay to be pragmatic about the bad and the negative. Don't want to overly compartmentalize, but the equation should be balanced, and sometimes we just have to look for it.
The website is connectionswellnessgroup.com if you'd like to go on there and find out more about the organization. I see you've got locations in and around the Dallas Metroplex mainly, right?
That is correct.
All right. Well, what do you suggest if there's a parent out there that is concerned with their child's mental health potentially? Who do they go talk to first? They need to try to find a healthcare professional in their neck of the woods?
I think the healthcare professions are all around us, but more than anything, my encouragement to parents and guardians alike would just have the conversation. It's really not as scary as we think. We're not going to plant ideas in our children's head just by talking about it. And if anything, we're going to enhance the trusting relationships that we have when we model the ability to have tough conversations. So I'd say have the conversation, see where it goes, and then access the resources so readily available in the communities.
All right, Austin Gregg, who's the CEO of Connections Wellness Group, thanks for joining us here today. Appreciate your time.
Have a great day.